Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the final event of our Spring 2022 Georgia College Creative Writing Program Visiting Writers Series. Dr. Carrie Neville, and I'm the coordinator of the Creative Writing Program. And thanks so much for joining us on this spring evening. We have a wonderful lineup of readers this evening. We have two Georgia College MFA students, third-year students who will be graduating in a few weeks, Shannon Yarbrough and Denisha Powell, followed by our visiting writer, Gayle Brandeis. So without further ado, let's get started. I am going to introduce Shannon Yarbrough, who will be our first reader. Shannon Yarbrough. With a century of family history in Georgia, Shannon Yarbrough writes about her beloved and conflicted Deep South through intimate reflections on relationships and community. Her insights come from living and working in Atlanta, her role as a queer single parent, as well as extensive domestic and international travel. Now in her final semester studying creative nonfiction at Georgia College, Shannon has received support from Martha's Vineyard Institute of Creative Writing, the Hambidge Center, Wild Acres Retreat, and In Cahoots in Petaluma, California. Shannon Yarbrough, everyone.
Thank you so much, Carrie. I'm going to read today the beginning of an essay that was very challenging for me to write. And I'd like to thank Peter Seljan for his support with this essay early on. Here we go. It's called I Don't Know Tomorrow. This is a story about two men who had nothing to do with one another, but everything to do with me. I met them both when I was 24. Carl was my boss. Jed was my lover. Jed's story led me to the balcony railing of a top floor San Francisco hotel suite. Carl's story stopped me from jumping. Carl was in his early 50s, tall and overweight, and had a huge smile. He wore his dark hair in a tight square cut around his clean-shaven face. When we met at the marketing firm where I worked as a creative director's assistant, he was loud and happy, always greeting everyone by name. I knew when he entered the office because I heard the dull clank of ice against his 52-ounce Quick Trip cup full of Coca-Cola. Carl made his fortune in the 90s with telecommunications software. He often reminisced about that first success, the thrill of making an idea come to life. He was at the marketing agency as a client for his newest entrepreneurial adventure, a health startup called Thrive Connect, which aimed to integrate health tracking tools in one platform. Now, the concept is ubiquitous, but in 2012, there was a race to see who could make it happen first. He built the company for his wife of 20 years, Mindy, who was a nutritionist. Daily, Carl talked about how much he loved his wife. Since this company was for her, it had to work. At first, the frequency of the proclamation was charming. Later, I wondered if his gushing was compensation for the demons Mindy helped him battle behind closed doors. A few months after we met, I was laid off from the marketing agency. On a visit to the office to see my former coworkers, I ran into Carl. While catching up, he told me Thrive Connect was on track to change the world, and we'll all make a lot of money, he added with a wink. Holding the door as I turned to leave, he asked if I wanted a job. I started the following week. Jed and I met in January of 2012, a month before I started at Thrive Connect. I was in Nicaragua visiting 3 friends from college. We climbed a volcano and rode horses, went surfing, danced, and smoked cigars. We took taxis up the Pacific coast, hours-long drives during which we shared peeled oranges and bottled water and looked out the window, backpacks on our laps. Jed ran into us on a street corner in Granada. He made the light conversation typical of tourists. Where are you staying? When do you leave? That day happened to be our last. Jed was short but taller than me, with small bright eyes and large lips. I guessed he was between 5 and 10 years older. I wasn't immediately attracted to him, but I sensed he was smart. My friends didn't trust him. I attributed their distance to the fact that he wasn't paying attention to them. Of the 4 of us, he singled me out. Shannon has another admirer, Kara said as we turned to leave. Hearing her comment, I felt a burst of anticipation. A few days earlier, Kara had left me standing naked on a floating dock at Lake Apoyo with a Dutchman whose name I didn't know. The three of us had been skinny dipping when suddenly Kara swam to shore. Bewildered, I stayed on the dock. The man asked to kiss me. 3 orgasms later, I returned to the hostel to find my friends readying for bed. I told them about my time on the dock. Kara shook her head and left the room. 5 minutes later, she returned with the guy by her side. You two share a room, and the three of us will sleep in the other one, she said. The next morning, the roaring sounds of birds and monkeys woke us up. Finally, I asked his name, Tees. We had overslept and missed the bus my friends and I had planned to take to the next city. So instead of leaving, the 5 of us took another dip in the lake. We parted ways later that day without sharing contact information. Before arriving in Nicaragua, I've been hoping to have my first one-night stand. I'd even meditated on the possibility using techniques I learned in a weekly meditation class based on the law of attraction. I named what I wanted: fun, connection, thrill, pleasure. And once I moved into the feeling place of those terms, my vibration was ready to attract it. After that magical night, I knew the meditation worked. If Jed sent something in me, it may have been my desire to have such a special experience again. When we ran into him several hours later in a small museum, my friends went to another room. I hung behind. Alone, we cracked jokes about the statue's stern expressions. I translated Spanish descriptions and he complimented my dress. Sometimes he stood too close. I asked what he did for work. I'm a writer, he said. I wanted more than anything to be a writer. I'd put the dream on hold in favor of a salary to pay off student loans. Jed had published a book and was doing research for the next. That evening, he asked me to come back with him to his hostel, but I declined. I wanted to spend the last night of the trip with my friends. When Jed looked crestfallen, I asked where he lived. He answered New Orleans. I travel there often for vacation, I said. I can look you up. That's a nice way to say you aren't into me, he said. If you don't give me your number, you'll never know, I replied. He tore a piece of paper out of his notebook. As he wrote, I asked him to add the title of his book.
Thank you, Shannon. Thank you so much. Our next reader is Denisha Powell. Denisha Powell is a coastal Georgia-born and raised movement journalist, essayist, grant writer, cat parent, spouse, and auntie living in Atlanta occupied Creek territory. Their writing has been published in various online and print publications, including Harper's Bazaar, The Oxford American, Prism, Scalawag, and Vice. Denisha Powell.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much. Carrie, thank you for asking me to read. Gayle, it was so great to have you speak to Dr. Nigwe's class yesterday. Really appreciated, just appreciated you and hearing more about you reading that Audre Lorde speech, and yeah, really appreciated you. Shannon, my old carpool buddy, it's good to be here reading with you. And so I decided to read, Gayle, it seems like you write a lot about family, that's what us who write nonfiction do. We write about our lives, right? So I'm reading an essay called Finding Grandma. You know I can dine with kings and queens, Grandma said to me with a glint in her eye. One of her signature sayings. We were eating breakfast at a University of Georgia Parents Weekend, sitting underneath a big white tent with my mother and my boyfriend alongside other families. We sat right beside the campus chapel, an imposing white Greek revival structure with 6 huge columns where we went to service afterward. It's easy to understand why Grandma felt regal there. That was the first and last time Grandma visited me at college. She died the following summer of lung cancer, yet her quirks, qualities, and adages are imprinted on my brain. She chain smoked Virginia Slims and tried to conceal the smell with perfume. She guzzled Pepsi like it was water. She cooked a flavorful dinner for us nearly every night, but rarely took a bite because she ate like a bird and had this svelte figure to prove it. Instead of buying new clothes, she sifted through me and my sister's bags that were headed for Goodwill. Grandma was raised by an uncle and aunt, John Henry and Ida Mae Ford, in an all-Black hamlet called Meridian in coastal Georgia. There, she struggled to provide for her two children, my mother and Uncle Ray. She made a pittance heading shrimp at the Meridian dock, working as a short order cook and cleaning white people's homes, supplementing meals with fresh seafood caught by neighbors. There was something inside of Grandma that wished to transcend the life of Black she was born into. She was one of the first in her family to graduate high school, segregated, of course, where she played on the basketball team. She migrated to New York City in the 1960s, where she found better paying work as a certified nursing assistant at a hospital. At the peak of New York City's HIV/AIDS and crack cocaine crises, Grandma moved back to Georgia and worked in my elementary school's cafeteria. She lived in a few different working class apartment buildings in my hometown, Brunswick, 30 miles south of Meridian, from where her magical fingers grew various plants, including cannabis, whipped up low country boils, and kept a goldfish alive longer than I've ever seen. She made everyone feel like royalty, establishing a monthly birthday celebration in the annex of the church in Meridian that kicked her out as an unwed teen mother. Grandma wanted to give me the world, driving me to her place after school in her sporty white Pontiac Grand Prix. She would sometimes stop at Food Lion, grin in my direction, and ask, "You want a piece of candy?" Of course I did. I had an insatiable sweet tooth. She handed me her book of food stamps and pulled out a cigarette as I rushed into the grocery store. After making my selection, usually Skittles or Starburst, I happily presented a food stamp coupon to the cashier. On those days, I felt like the luckiest granddaughter in the world. Other times we headed to a gas station after school and she instructed me to choose 6 numbers so she could play the lottery. I knew if her lottery numbers ever hit, our entire family would be taken care of, but they never did. By the time I went to college to study journalism, Grandma had retired from her cafeteria job and lived off a minuscule amount of money from her Social Security check and a part-time job at a convenience store. I remember when she called me during a dance practice, and I took a break to chat with her. "I miss you," she told me. "I want to be able to send you a little cash." She died less than a year later, never able to send me money at school, but I knew she would have if she had it. A testament to how well-loved Grandma was, every pew was filled at her funeral. Dressed in Black, my sisters and I stood at the front of the church beside her casket as the service began, and the funeral goers got their last look at her body. The moment felt so surreal that I remained composed when the funeral director closed Grandma's casket while Renee and Nicole bawled. My voice cracked, but I didn't cry as I read an original poem for Grandma during the service, nor when her body was lowered into the ground at a cemetery down the street from the church in sweltering July heat. When I returned to college the next month, I taped a photo to my wall of her holding me as a baby, with her eyes turned downward and her smooth, buttery brown skin shining, accented by a red tank top and gold earrings. A year of heartbreak ensued as I found it increasingly difficult to juggle a full class load, a part-time job, and emergent health problems. I no longer had a grandmother to turn to. No more of Grandma's effortless dishes, no more holiday Barbie dolls from her for Christmas, no more Grandma to point at me proudly and proclaim to whoever I was one of her grands, nor to defend me from Mommy's petty judgments, like when she made fun of my top lip being darker than my bottom one at the parents' weekend breakfast. "That's the beauty in it," Grandma swiftly explained. I honor Grandma through preserving her pictures. I post photos of her on social media to stamp her into time immemorial. My wife, AJ, and I placed a picture of Grandma posing with her hands on her hips, front and center at our wedding reception, and then on the fridge of the first home we owned. Her best friends were a lesbian couple, so she wouldn't have batted an eye at our queer marriage. The photo that once graced my college apartment wall now sits on me and AJ's altar beside photos of others we have loved and lost. I never thought much about Grandma's final resting place until Mommy called me with a proposal from Uncle Ray. He wanted our family to put a headstone on Grandma's grave and then eat at a nearby seafood restaurant. My mother loved her mother dearly, but she wasn't at all amenable to her brother's suggestion. The family doesn't come together like that anymore, Mommy said exasperatedly. Like all families, we fight, and Mommy lets go of grudges at a snail's pace. She was feuding with one of my sisters at the time, so she refused to consider my uncle's plan. Our phone call quickly devolved into a shouting match. I hung up so infuriated by Mommy's stubbornness that the reality of Grandma's unmarked grave barely registered. I hadn't been to her grave since her funeral, so I always assumed she had a headstone. I never visited Grandma's grave because my relationship with home is complicated. It's difficult to separate my feelings about coastal Georgia from my childhood of being teased for looking and talking funny and perpetually being one of the only Black kids in gifted classes. I spent years avoiding my hometown and even moved clear across the country with AJ to Seattle. After 4 years, we moved back south and settled in Atlanta, 5 hours away from my hometown. Despite being closer to home, I initially had no intention of visiting. It took a tremendous loss in my home community for me to return. The COVID-19 pandemic had just begun when I came across a New York Times article about the murder of Ahmaud Arbery, a Black man shot and killed while jogging in a Brunswick subdivision by 3 white men, one of whom I shared a Spanish class with in 9th grade. Over the phone, my little brother told me Ahmaud's football locker was near his own in high school. A video of Ahmaud being gunned down and left to die on the ground went viral soon after the New York Times story came out. I couldn't stop thinking it could have easily been me in that video, or my brother, or another family member. I started following the news in coastal Georgia closely and pivoted to reporting on the uprising spurred by Ahmaud's death, the toxic chemical sites in Brunswick's Black neighborhoods, and other local cultural, political, and social issues. This work requires me to immerse myself in the region's history. As a child, I found Sunday drives from Brunswick to Church and Meridian to be sleepy and dull. Maybe I would have thought differently if I'd known about the blood, sweat, and tears embedded in every mile of the trip. Only in the past few years did I find out the dilapidated white mansion sitting on top of wetlands on Highway 17 was built on Butler Island Plantation, where enslaved Africans once cultivated rice. A tall brick structure in front of the mansion remains from when a rice mill operated there. Some of the enslaved Africans on the plantation were sold by Pierce Meese Butler in the largest slave auction in history, now known as the Weeping Time, because of the rain that poured down during the travesty and the tears shed on the auction block. Their descendants are now fighting to save the property from speculative developers. Coastal Georgia is bursting at the seams with historical sites and narratives like these that unfortunately aren't taught in schools. And I feel like I've read for a long time. I can keep going, Carrie, or stop.
I think maybe perhaps wrap it up just so that we can move on to Gayle, but thank you so much.
Okay, didn't want to take up all the time. I'll read like a little bit more. My spouse tells me I get excited when we get off the highway exit to Brunswick. My face lights up with familiarity as I point out all my old haunts. There are certain places where I can feel Grandma's presence. This past Juneteenth weekend, my spouse and I vacationed in Jekyll Island, which is in the same county as my hometown. It was AJ's first time there. As we drove onto the island after paying an $8 parking fee, I recounted my scattered memories of Jekyll, going to Summer Waves Water Park for free because my friends worked there, competing in dance competitions at the convention center, staying up all night talking to my boyfriend on a Days Inn landline while at cheerleading camp. I asked AJ to accompany me to a place in Jekyll that reminds me of Grandma, St. Andrews Beach. When my family would drive by it, Grandma often said matter-of-factly, That's the only beach us Black folks could go to back in the day. I only recently learned one of the last slave ships in the United States illegally landed on the shores of St. Andrews Beach in 1858. Today, there's an exhibit at the beach named after the vessel, the Wanderer Memory Trail. Pulling into the crowded parking lot of St. Andrews Beach on Juneteenth, we observed people of all hues enjoying themselves, picnicking and playing volleyball under ancient mossy live oak trees, watching birds from an observatory tower, wading into the murky water and attempting to dodge oyster beds. We decided to walk the memory trail first, where we were soon joined by a group of Black folks with their cameras in tow. The trail comprises markers and music telling the story of a fictional boy named Amwala to represent the Africans smuggled from the Congo and brought to the shores of Jekyll 51 years after the ban of the slave trade. I greedily read the list of the 407 surviving West African passengers that arrived on the Wanderer, as if I might recognize a family name or surname. Sorrow welled up in my throat as I silently mourned the names of my ancestors lost in the Middle Passage. The names of ancestors I know, like Grandma's Carolyn Augusta, are precious to me. And I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Denisha. And now I will turn back to Shannon Yarbrough, who will introduce Gayle Brandeis.
Thanks again, Carrie. Thank you, Nisha, for your beautiful reading. I'm honored tonight to introduce Gayle Brandeis, a writer who has published poetry, fiction, and creative nonfiction. I enjoyed reading some of her work, as well as the generous insights she shared in both Dr. Inigwe's Discomforts class, as well as her craft Q&A earlier today. I know that for those of us graduating, a chapter of ours is coming to a close. In that spirit, I want to share a quote from one of Gayle's recent essays about her recovery from COVID-19. While taking slow walks in the woods, her entire life a new pace as she healed, she noticed new sights she hadn't before. The experience prompted her to share this. Quote, I often tell my students the most important part of being a writer is staying open. Keeping our hearts open, our minds open, our senses open, so we can stay open to inspiration, which can strike from unexpected places. I realized this advice doesn't just apply to writers. It applies to all artists, and really it applies to all humans who want to stay awake and aware, end quote. Thank you, Gayle, for these beautiful words. I hope we can all carry this openness into the world as we conclude this semester and welcome what comes next. Before we hear Gayle's reading, I will share a few highlights from her website. Gayle Brandeis grew up in the Chicago area and has been writing poems and stories since she was 4 years old. She is the author of Fruit Flesh, Seeds of Inspiration for Women Who Write, dictionary poems, 3 novels, The Book of Dead Birds, which won Barbara Kingsolver's Bellwether Prize for Fiction of Social Engagement, Self-Storage, and Delta Girls, as well as her first novel for young readers, My Life with the Lincolns. In 2017, she released a collection of poetry, The Selfless Bliss of the Body, and a memoir, The Art of Misdiagnosis, Surviving My Mother's Suicide. Her novel and poems, Many Restless Concerns, The Victims of Countess Bathory's Speak in Chorus, A Testimony, was published in February 2020. She also has an essay collection coming out in February next year called Drawing Breath. Gayle currently teaches in the low residency MFA programs at Antioch University, Los Angeles, and Sierra Nevada University, where she was named Distinguished Visiting Professor/Writer in Residence in 2014 and 15. Gayle is the founding editor of the online journal Lady Liberty Lit, and she is also a mother of 3. Thank you so much for joining us, Gayle, and welcome.
Thank you so much for that lovely, generous introduction, Shannon. And thank you, Shannon and Denisha, for those beautiful readings. It was such a joy to hear you both. And I look forward to reading your books someday. Thank you all for having me. Thank you, Carrie, for inviting me. It's been such a treat to visit with all of you in the classes and the Q&A earlier today. Yeah, I'm just so grateful to be here. Thank you all so much. And I'm going to read 3 short essays from my forthcoming essay collection. So I will get started. All right, the first one is called Rib Cage, a meditation in 12 bones. And it starts with an epigraph from Natalie Diaz's poem, Postcolonial Love Poem, which reads, "The seeds remember what their God whispered into their ribs. Wake up and ache for your life." 1. True rib. I've been sick for several weeks, presumed COVID, and I'm now dealing with what my doctor thinks could be post-viral costochondritis, an inflammation of the cartilage between the ribs and around the breastbone. I've never been as aware of my ribs as I have these last few weeks. They grump at me with every breath, sometimes through pain, sometimes by resisting each inhale. They've never felt so much like a cage, my lungs' large pulpy wings trapped inside. 2. True rib. The rib cage is also called the thoracic basket. I love how these words sound together, that hiss in the middle of each, thoracic basket. My basket is made of concrete and steel. My basket sometimes feels full of wet muscle, sometimes venomous teeth. 3. True rib. Maybe you've cracked a rib, a friend says, telling me she cracked ribs coughing when she had a bad case of flu. She said it felt like there was a band around her chest, and it does feel like there's a band around my chest too, tight and strong. But in the X-ray, my ribs look fine, ghostly fingers splayed beneath my skin. 4. True rib. We have 7 true ribs, 3 false ribs, 2 floating ribs. The true ribs span from spine to breastbone. The false connect to the breastbone via cartilage. The floating attach only to the backbone, their fronts hovering inside our bodies, free. 5. True rib. I've taken 2 courses of antibiotics this illness, a short course of steroids, used 2 different inhalers and a nebulizer. But the thing that's helped most is my husband rubbing my ribs. He'll stand behind me and run his hands up and down the sides of my rib cage fast, like he's playing Flight of the Bumblebee on a washboard, and a riot of pain and pleasure ricochets through my body. When he removes his hands, my ribs continue to pleasantly burn. 6. True rib. Each rib has 3 parts, a head, a neck, a shaft. It makes me think of Eve being made of Adam's rib, that head and neck and shaft, no womb, just hard bone. This myth has always irked me. I rename the parts of the rib to my own liking: lip, crest, curl. 7. True rib. My father cracked one of my mother's ribs on one of their early dates. He was lifting her into a boat for a tour of Lake Michigan off the coast of Chicago, and his oar-like thumb snapped the delicate bone. The only time he ever physically hurt her, although she'd claim otherwise decades later in the grip of paranoid delusion. I wonder if her rib healed properly, if it ached when I was growing beneath it. 8. False rib. The Sumerian word ti means both rib and to live. The Sumerian goddess of life, Ninti, was birthed to heal the rib of Enki, the god of creation, after he had eaten forbidden flowers. Some people believe the Adam and Eve story stems from this myth. Some people who believe the Adam and Eve story think men have 1 less rib than women, but this isn't true. We all have 12 pairs, except for the occasional human who has what's called a gorilla rib, a 13th pair like those in the animals we evolved from. 9. False rib. When I was a teenager, my parents tried to take me to a hot new rib joint in Chicago named Bones, but the line to get in was long and we were too hungry to wait 2 hours for platters of sticky, spicy, sweet baby backs. My sister, 9 at the time, was visiting relatives out of state. She called in the middle of the night homesick, and my mom answered the phone in her sleep. "Bones," she moaned to my freaked out sister, likely dreaming of the ribs she hadn't been able to gnaw that evening. "Bones." 10. False rib. In Babylonian mythology, heaven and earth are crafted from the ribs of Tiamat, the goddess of salt water and chaos. Are we her vital organs then? Her alveoli, her breath? Does her cage ever ache with the swell of us all? 11, floating rib. Maybe my tight, inflamed ribs are my body's way of trying to protect me after I've shed the virus, each bone a curved arm, a mother holding me close. 12, floating rib. Halfway through the cremation process, the crematory operator hooks the rib cage with the rake and stirs the body around so the flames will lick it clean. I sweep my fingers over my own ribs now, dig my thumbs into the aching living tissue between them, the place the rake will someday catch. So that's the first one. Find the second one, which is an essay called Eating the Food of the Dead that appeared in the normal school. The last day I saw her alive, my mom left a bottle of Snapple in my fridge. Diet peach iced tea, the kind with real facts printed inside the cap. Example, real fact number 776, more babies are born at night than during the day. I had given birth at 10:33 just 2 nights before. My mom carried Snapples around with her because she only trusted sealed beverages those days, only trusted prepackaged food. She thought numerous people, including my beloved father, were trying to poison her. Her perception of real facts was wildly different from anyone else's, deserving of the quotation marks the beverage company put around the facts inside their lids. She believed she was being persecuted, being chased, believed these were the most real facts in the world. I could barely stand to look at her bottle of iced tea after we got news of her death. I avoided it in the fridge like the poison my mother had been so afraid of, something too caustic to touch. Real fact number 722. The peach was the first fruit to be eaten on the moon. Less than a month after my mom's suicide, my mother-in-law came over to make Christmas dinner. I was hiding in my dark bedroom with the baby, not feeling up to a visit, but she barged in and insisted I join her and my husband at the table. She could be a difficult woman, snippy and intolerant, and she had never acknowledged my mother's death to me directly, not even one word of condolence, but I could tell she was trying in her own way to be kind. She was from Denmark and let me know she had made a few of her favorite Danish dishes: cucumber salad, new potatoes cooked with parsley, a huge vat of red cabbage. Real fact number 822. The only jointless bone in the body is in your throat. The cabbage might give the baby gas, I told her, worried about it coming through my breast milk. I was in a constant state of worry following my mother's death, but she tisked at my concern and said red cabbage was traditionally given to new mothers to encourage milk production. I scooped up the baby and tentatively ventured out of the bedroom, the light of the rest of the house stinging my eyes. The cabbage smelled awful, but tasted quite good, stewed with vinegar and sugar. We still had a heap of it in our freezer when less than 3 months later, my mother-in-law died of a sudden heart attack. Real fact number 302. Ketchup was once sold as a medicine. Reeling with grief, my husband and I carried my mom's Snapple and his mom's cabbage with us when we moved to a new house and put them in the extra fridge/freezer in our new basement. They hunkered there like bitter talismans. I could feel them underneath us as we moved through the house. I didn't know what to do with that tea or that pungent cruciferous tangle. It felt wrong to ingest them, wrong to throw them away. They sat in silent reproach like our mothers with their arms crossed, angry at being ignored. Real fact number 351. Cold water weighs less than hot water. On the anniversary of my mother-in-law's death in 2011, we decided to heat up a portion of that red cabbage in her honor. My husband choked down a few bites and tears and pushed his plate across the table. After we sold our house in 2014, we threw the remaining cabbage away, and I finally popped open the bottle of Diet Peach tea. I took one swig, cringed at the sweet chemical punch of it, then poured the rest down the drain. I didn't even check to see what was written inside the cap. The only real fact I knew at that moment was I was ready to let go of the bottle and all it held. Real fact number 62. The lifespan of a taste bud is 10 days. My father's freezer was full of frozen Stouffer's dinners when he died. Turkey tetrazzini and escalloped chicken and noodles, his last stabs at independence. Real fact number 416. Many butterflies and moths are able to taste with their feet. One evening, our dad comatose a few feet away, my siblings and I decided to heat up those frozen meals for ourselves in his honor. I've been vegetarian since I was 16 and had cut out gluten and dairy a couple of years before for health reasons, but the escalloped chicken and noodles had been a favorite treat when I was a kid. Back when my mom would bake it in the oven in its foil container and the breadcrumbs on top would turn crispy and golden. And I fished out the pieces I could eat, the tender slices of button mushroom, the soft sawtooth slivers of celery. I wiped away as much of the creamy chicken brothy sauce as I could, but I could still taste it, and it transported me back to my childhood kitchen table, full glasses of milk and water in front of me, both parents healthy and smiling and alive. Real fact number 364. Borborygmi is the noise that your stomach makes when you're hungry. Because of my dietary restrictions, I wasn't able to eat much of the food my dad left behind. His favorite Pepperidge Farm raspberry thumbprint cookies, the Marion berry ice cream in his freezer, the fun-sized Snicker bars he kept in a bowl for caregivers and other staff, the English muffins he loved to eat with apricot jam and almond butter. I ate what I could, the almond butter straight from the jar, excuse me, the tins of cashews, the stiffened prunes. I wanted to eat all of it, to taste everything he had loved on this earth. Real fact number 714. When thirsty, a camel can drink 25 gallons of water in less than 3 minutes. At the celebration of my dad's life a couple of months after his death, we made his favorite sandwich in the kitchenette of my sister's hotel room. Toasted rye with mayonnaise, Swiss cheese, and bread and butter pickles, forever to be known as a buzz sandwich, and cut it into small squares. We divvied his ashes into paper lunch sacks, one for each person present, then added the squares of sandwich. Everyone wrote messages to him on the bags. Some of us included quotes from the wonders he had filled notebooks with since his retirement at 85, and headed down to the same oceanside pier where we had released my mom's ashes 7 years before. Real fact number 782. The human jaw can generate a force up to 200 pounds on the molars. Real fact. As per my dad's request, we played Louis Prima's Enjoy Yourself, It's Later Than You Think, through the little speaker in my phone and danced together on the pier. Real fact number 25. The only food that does not spoil is honey. Real fact. We cast the bags to the water and watched them drift away, sending him off with the food of the living. And I will share one more short essay. I referenced this one in Chica's class. Actually, this was the essay that I wrote over 20 years ago when my daughter was learning to write. And I thought I would share that since I mentioned it. And it's a happier one to end with than ending with all the death. Okay, this is called Spelling. When Jewish children begin to study Torah, rabbis will sometimes give them a spoonful of honey, so they'll always associate learning with sweetness. I brought home alphabet cookies with a similar intention, figuring they'd provide a delicious reading lesson for my 5-year-old daughter. I could picture us at the table together, spelling cat and love and apple on our plates, mouths full of shortbread and sugar and the lingering sweetness of words. When I got home, I discovered Hannah had been sent to her room for some minor infraction, and she was not happy about it. Had she whined? Maybe. Had she cried? Most likely. I wasn't there to hear her protests. But she had found a way to document her experience. She had written. I should mention Hannah had never written anything on her own before this, other than her own name and the names of her family members. She had never constructed a sentence, had never sat down with the intention of getting her thoughts on paper. But somehow in the hour I was gone, she pretty much figured out the whole writing process. As I walked through her door, Hannah handed me a piece of paper. And I wish I could show you the fun spelling she had, but you just have to trust me that when I read her words, it's very cute alternative spelling. Dear Mom, it said, Dad is always mean. Rough drafts of the letter were scattered around her room. Dry Mom, one began. Dear Ma'am, read another. I was blown away. Not only had Hannah written a sentence for the first time, she had edited her own work. It took me years to make friends with the revision process. Hannah shook hands with it her first time out. My heart filled to bursting. My little girl, a writer. My husband was amazed too, although he was not completely thrilled to be the villain of her first literary undertaking. This gave us a little peek into what it must feel like to read a daughter's memoir. Wait, the author's parents must want to say, that's not the whole story. We bought her a snow cone from the ice cream truck just minutes before the alleged incident. She was only sent to her room because she threw a stick at her brother's head. Before anyone could get too worked up about her angry output, Hannah began another series of letters, sweet as any sugar cookie. Dear people, she wrote, I love everyone. Dear Idaho, another said, I would like to go there. It didn't take long, however, for her to return to her writer girl roots. In a little heart-covered pastel papered notebook, she wrote more scathing critiques of her dad and some of her brother. I somehow managed to escape her writerly wrath. Mom, she wrote in her journal, why are you so lovable? I knew I wouldn't be immune to her poison pen forever, but I enjoyed being the subject of these little tributes. Who needs good reviews when your own daughter writes, that dance was groovy? And my mom is a poet. You can tell because of her books. Hannah often sat on the couch, one leg crossed over the other like a stenographer from a 40s movie, pencil and notebook in hand. She loved to write lists, lobster, fish, shrimp, shark, chicken, turkey, duck, rooster, little inventories of the world she knows. She had her own dictionary of bad words, which read ass, asshole. She seemed to know writing was a safe place to explore the taboo, to delve into rage and joy and the enchantment of the ordinary. I have my own way of spelling, Hannah said excitedly, as if she'd created her own civilization. When she'd ask how to spell something correctly, I'd tell her, but I loved the playful, fluid way she chose to spell words. I wanted to give her more time to swim around in her own language before she had to worry about spelling tests or red pencil marks. Those would come soon enough. I thought of Margaret Atwood's poem Spelling, which opens, my daughter plays on the floor with plastic letters, red, blue, and hard yellow, learning how to spell, spelling, how to make spells. Hannah was learning how to make spells, her own magic. Hannah and I never did have our sugar cookie spelling lesson. Our family polished off the container of treats like speed readers, spilling letter crumbs everywhere before we could act out my plan. Anyway, Hannah had taught herself more than those cookies ever could. The very last page of Hannah's heart notebook read in large letters, I am just fine. Isn't that ultimately what we all try to say when we write? That we and our words are valid, that we deserve to be heard? Atwood writes later in the same poem, a word after a word after a word is power. How beautiful to watch my daughter discover that power inside her. She helped me remember my own power as well. Words sweet and biting, pungent and nourishing in all of our fingers, on both of our tongues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gayle. That was really beautiful, all three essays. Yeah. So we have about 10 minutes. If anybody has any questions for Gayle, you can either put them in the chat or you can unmute yourself and ask away. Sure, it would be great to continue the conversation that started in the craft Q&A earlier today.
Thank you all for all the kind comments. I really appreciate it.
Jump in with a quick question, Gail. You had mentioned with this essay that you returned to it after many years and you made some revisions later. And I'm just curious if you remember any of the changes or maybe just a short reflection on what it's like to look back at a piece of writing from a long time ago.
Sure. One thing that I made or that I noticed I had done in this old essay was I used the word though all over the place. And it was something that one of my mentors when I was getting my NMFA pointed out that I overused the word though, but that was after I wrote this piece. And yeah, so I was like, wow, I really did overuse the word though. So that's the biggest one I can remember. I trimmed a few things here and there. Mostly took out those little just extra words that didn't belong. And it was really fun to return to this one. Even all these years later, that's one of my favorite essays I ever wrote. And it was one of my first essays because I was getting my MFA in fiction at the time. I had been primarily a poet before then. And this was the first, it was published in Salon magazine. It was my first kind of big byline. And it remains really a beloved poem to me. And my daughter really loves it too. And she's finally going back to school to get her degree in English and is a writer herself still. And it's just lovely to have this memory of the beginning of her writing life.
There's a question in the chat for you from Kyla. And it's, I've read your book, The Art of Misdiagnosis. What was the most challenging part you faced while writing it?
Oh, thanks for that, Kyla. That book challenged me at every turn. It was, I mentioned it earlier, it was the hardest book I've ever written. The hardest part, I think, was writing the scenes that were most painful, such as the scene where I found out about my mother's suicide when we got the call from the coroner's office. I tiptoed around that scene for a very long time and finally worked my way into it. And that one scene, I ended up writing part of it in third person. It's the only part of the book where I write about myself in third person. And it was my attempt to capture the sense of disassociation that I had at the moment of finding out the news, where I felt like I was watching myself from somewhere on the ceiling. And just finding my way into that scene was really hard, but making that craft choice to write that one little paragraph in third person helps me find my way into it and helps me be able to capture that sense of disassociation. Yeah, so that was certainly one of the hardest scenes. Just much of it was very hard to write. Writing about some of my own most difficult choices in my life, such as when I pretended to be sick for a year as a teenager. That was really hard to face. Although, as I mentioned I think it was in Chica's class yesterday, that once I started sharing that story publicly, I was getting laughter as a response, which I wasn't expecting at all. And that helped me to face my own story, to see that it could have some humor in it. Yeah, that helps me a lot, but it was all challenging. It was also challenging. I'm so grateful for the challenge. I'm grateful that I kept with it, even though it was so incredibly painful. It's hard for me to express pride in myself. That's something that's just a difficult emotion for me. But I felt really proud of that memoir, just being able to push through the pain and get the words onto the page. I wasn't sure I was capable of it, and I did it. So, yeah.
Thank you, Gail. We have another question in the chat. Does your daughter still write today?
She does. She's a beautiful writer, and she actually shared some of her work with me last semester just to get my feedback for a creative writing class. And it was so beautiful. And it was really cool to see her writing fiction, which I hadn't seen her fiction before. And yeah, I'm just so excited to see where her writing will take
Do
her.
you already take E question mark?
E question mark?
That was an unintended interruption, I think.
Yeah, Hannah, for a while, if you've read my memoir, you saw that she dropped out of high school. Traditional school just wasn't the right thing for her. She's brilliant. She got her GED. She ended up getting like a perfect score on the English SATs, but then she just wasn't ready to go to college for a while. And she did stand-up comedy for a long time. And oh, no worries, Genevieve. And she wouldn't let me see her stand up. I think I likely was, a subject of her stand-up routines. And I totally, let her have that space. But I was curious about it. So I'm just so grateful that she's allowed me to read her work, which is just gorgeous and yeah, very alive.
To pick up on a thread from the earlier craft Q&A, you had mentioned that you have a new craft book in the works that's based on what we as writers can learn from animals. And I know your earlier craft book was about fruit and what we can learn about writing from fruit. I'm wondering if you could give us a little preview. What can we learn from animals as writers?
Oh my gosh, we can learn so much from animals. I think a lot about trusting our instincts, listening to our bodies, and pouncing on the ideas that we have. I'm for some reason my brain isn't letting me think of anything specific. One thing we can try to punch like a mantis shrimp. It punches its prey, and it punches with such force that it creates heat that rivals the heat of the sun, like literally. And so it stuns its prey. And so we can learn to punch like that as writers to hopefully stun in the best way our readers. But yeah, there's so much just in terms of like different ways birds build nests. There are certain birds that like the kind of bird, and I can't think of the name right now, but the bird that makes the bird's nest soup, that bird's nests that go in the bird's nest soup, they create their nests out of their own bodies. So if we, are the kind of writer who uses our body as a source of inspiration, we may be like that type of bird. But other birds, like the common tailor bird, will very meticulously stitch together leaves and things like that, and use the resources they find in the outer world to very carefully put something together. So we can look at the different ways that birds create their nests, the different ways birds stalk or animals stalk their prey, the different bird songs. There are different types of bird song, which can speak to different types of writing, where sometimes a bird will make a sound out of alarm, and perhaps we want to write as alarm to alert people to a certain danger of the world, whereas other times we just want to sing together and express joy in our writing. Yeah, so things like that. I've been having so much fun putting this book together, and I'm sorry I can't think of anything a little bit more specific, but
Oh,
it's
that's
really
okay.
about just like finding our most embodied, authentic voice. That's
Well,
truest to our own nature.
I can't wait to add that to my craft book library.
Thank you.
We have another question from Kelsey. She says, forgive me, I forget the title of the second essay you shared, but I was wondering how long it took you to write that piece and what was your process going into it?
Thank you. That one was called Eating the Food of the Dead. It came about because I was thinking about carrying that Snapple bottle around with me and my mother-in-law's cabbage. And I thought, I really need to write about this someday. And my way in was through those Snapple facts. I looked them up online. I found a site where all those Snapple facts had been compiled. And I found the ones that felt most resonant with the story. And in some cases, the Snapple fact would trigger a new scene to write. In other cases, I had written some part of it already, and I found a Snapple fact that was resonant with it. And then, after my dad died, I ate as much as I could of his food too. And it felt like a very different experience than carrying these really fraught items around with us that scared me so much. It was more a celebratory eating of what he left behind. And yeah, so I just tried to be as specific as I could with those foods and the experience with them. And yeah, then weaving those facts in.
Well, thank you so much, Gail. We're at the end of our time this evening. What a wonderful hour of creative nonfiction from Shannon and Denisha and Gail, our visiting writer here with us virtually in residency this week. It's been such a wonderful, wonderful time having you with us, in our classes, in the Q&A, and certainly this evening in the reading.
It's been such a pleasure for me. Thank you all just for this time. It's really been a treat to be in community with all of you. And I'm so glad I got to hear a couple of you read. Thank you again, Shannon and Denisha. And thank you to everyone in the classes and the Q&A today for your great questions and just sharing so much. I loved spending time with all of you.
And make sure, Shannon, Denisha, and Gail, you look through the chat. There's a lot of love for you posted in there and for your work. So I won't close out the Zoom until you've had a chance to scroll up. But thank you all, and thank you to Georgia College and the Department of English for funding our Visiting Writers series. And thank all of you for coming this evening, and stay safe and stay healthy out there in the world, and keep writing.